All right, welcome back, everyone. Foundations of Business, Management 1104 here at Pamplin College of Business. We're going to tackle now, finish chapter 3. Again, we've broken it up into two different parts, and we'll go ahead and get started on the second part here of chapter 3. So the other part of economic systems and talking about economics in general is looking at the various types of competition. And the first one we're going to talk about is a perfect competition. And in a perfect competition, there's really a sense of small companies selling identical products. So you can see here on the screen, we have a couple of ag products like corn and soybeans. Again, this is where the market, the price is determined by supply and demand. So we as consumers can determine the price and or outside influences. For example, if there's a storm or a flood and there's low supply, that can certainly drive up the price based on that. So this becomes the basics of the supply and demand curve. You look at the supply curve and think about this from a practical standpoint. As prices rise, what would a business want to do? You know, if prices continue to go up, what would a business want to do? Think about you as a business owner. If you were selling apples, if prices went up, you'd want to sell more apples. If prices fell or if prices fall, companies want to sell less. And that just becomes the supply and supply curve. As now on the demand side, you know, think about you as a buyer. What would you do if prices rise? When prices go up, the gasoline example that I used in the last discussion, people will buy less, okay? Prices of hotels, prices for airline tickets. When prices start to go up, people start to retreat. They start to hold on. They don't want to necessarily spend the money based on that. They want to value their money with regards to that. On the flip side of that, though, when prices fall, what do we do? What's the consumer behavior once prices fall? People traditionally, historically, will buy more. So again, just the basics, the foundational pieces of supply and demand. All right, equilibrium price is where the points where the two curves intersect, and that would be the ideal, best opportunity for both businesses and consumers would be at that equilibrium price. I would argue that gasoline over the last probably 5 to 6 years, plus or minus, has been in that equilibrium. Both the market and businesses seem to be pretty satisfied with where things were at that time. I would say, again, arguably that right now we're in this catch-up mode for petroleum manufacturers and drillers to try to make up for the losses that they had during the 2 years of the pandemic, when the demand for gas was low and prices remained low, but so did demand. So the top line revenues for these organizations suffered for 2 years, and they're trying to make up for it now. Going to get into some key terms over the next few minutes. These are all terms that you can find in the textbook. Certainly, this is not meant to be a vocabulary quiz or a vocabulary test, but certainly building the foundational knowledge of just common business terms that you're going to utilize throughout not only your Pamplin journey, but any type of internship and post-graduation as we go through. So just understanding the economy. One is oligopoly, a tough word for someone like myself that struggles with speech impediment, but oligopoly, this is where there's few sellers in the marketplace, but they supply a large portion of the products in the market. And so because of that, their products are similar and they can exert some control over price. And so what happens is there's a leader-follower process that goes on. So automobile manufacturers, airline companies, arguably, you look at apparel manufacturers. When one raises their price, the other will follow. And same on the flip side of lowering prices. And many, many times too, that when there are benefits or advantages to increase the value proposition within these types of markets, there would also be some areas to follow. Now, monopoly, I would think most of you, if not all of you, know what a monopoly is. Certainly that's the market. There's only one seller in that market. The single seller is able to control prices. The U.S. government tries to control monopolies through the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So if there's any types of mergers or acquisitions of large portions, there will be a review so that there's not a monopoly, because monopolies can happen in geographic areas as well as products and services. Now, there are a few monopolies in the U.S., and they fall into a couple of different categories. One is natural and legal, and that could be like public utilities, electricity, gas suppliers. On the legal one, it would be patent holders. So, we strongly encourage innovation and inventions. And so the U.S. government, U.S. society, business society will say, okay, you've spent a lot of time and effort, money, resources, time, talent, and treasure. We will reward that with a patent, which is 15 to 20 years, depending on when it was processed. And they will have legal rights to hold on to that particular product and or service through the patent, the way the patent is written. And so there could be some pricing controls that are leveraged through that. This is an example of an oligopoly. So you probably 8 to 10 years ago, plus or minus, you can see there were 6 major airlines in the country. I mean, obviously you still have Southwest and Frontier and Spirit that aren't on this list, but these were the top 6, Northwest Airlines, Continental, and US Airways. Those are probably names that you may have seen in the past, but through mergers and acquisitions, now all of a sudden there's just 3. Okay. Now, they went through the review when these mergers and acquisitions were announced. So they did go through government review, and it was determined that there was not going to be a monopoly that would be there. But what has happened now is, because there's less competition, if anyone has flown recently, it's not a fun experience. The customer service is poor. You pay your money, but not sure if you're going to be there on time. Certainly safety is important, but then you start to get concerned about that. And if anything, you just feel like you're part of a agricultural cattle, that's being told, where to go, when to go, and don't speak up. And so that's an example. When one raises prices, the other will follow. Some other key terms: gross domestic product. Keep in mind the GDP is based on what's manufactured or produced, so goods produced domestically in the country. And that's, an important aspect of this particular definition. Goods produced outside the country are excluded. So think about the products, some of the major purchases that you've bought in the last year. Could be your laptop, might be your mobile phone. Maybe it's a television at home in your apartment. Think about where were those manufactured? And if they were manufactured outside the U.S., they're not part of the gross domestic product. So you look at somebody like Apple. How much do they contribute to the GDP? Because the U.S.'s GDP, because most of those goods are produced outside the country. So now we start to match up some terms with indicators. And one of the first indicators here is the recession. So this is the slowdown in economic activity. When the GDP decreases, unemployment rises, and because of that, people have less money to spend. And this slowdown in activity is called a recession. Now, the true definition of a recession is when the GDP goes down for 2 consecutive quarters. Okay, so there's the slowdown in economic activity is a recession. The true definition from an economist standpoint is when the recession goes down for 2 consecutive quarters. Excuse me, when the GDP goes down for 2 consecutive quarters. I think I misspoke there. Consumer Price Index, CPI, this is a measure of inflation. We are going through that right now. This is reported by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS. You can look it up, bls.gov. Lots of information on that particular website. The CPI is measuring things like food, appliances, automobiles, medical care, housing, clothing. You can see the CPI over the last 60 years, been a couple of different spikes. Now, once we add, in fact, working on the 4th edition of the textbook right now, where we show 2021 and 2022, another spike in inflation. In fact, the worst inflation since the 1980s. And again, it's the measurement. Think about how much you have spent, or a carton of eggs a year ago to a carton of eggs now, gas a year ago to gas now. Now, the U.S. government tries to keep the inflation rate at 2%. Something to keep in mind. It's talked about in the textbook, but the U.S. government does try through monetary policy to keep our inflation rate at 2. Just a good pie chart kind of outlines the consumer price index, the components of that. Most of it is in housing. 42% of it is in housing. The next closest at 15% is transportation and food and beverages. Some economic indicators, right? So lagging indicators are things that have happened in the past. So looking at the status of the economy a few months in the past, like average length of unemployment. So this is a rear view mirror. Think about it from a lagging standpoint. Then there's predictive or leading indicators that we can look at. And that's based on, for example, building permits that are issued. If you look around, if you look around the U.S., you look around Blacksburg right now and all the cranes and all the construction, all that activity, one could predict that Southwest Virginia, more specifically Montgomery County and Blacksburg, along with the Commonwealth of Virginia, should be doing pretty well based on all the economic development, investment in the area should be there. What's interesting is I always try to put it into perspective. So this becomes a so what, who cares moment. Why are we talking about certain indicators? Well, I can tell you that this is something that in industry over the last few years, we actually at my organization, being in marketing, I had the role of really keeping our executive team, our sales team, our marketing team with market intelligence. And so this, for example, is the National Association of Manufacturers. This is their report. You can actually see this as well. You have access to it online. So we started to look at where's the economy going? What are manufacturers saying through surveys? And so what, who cares? Well, this could help us make our decisions. Do we need to hire more people? Should we invest? Do we need to start thinking about a retreat in employment with layoffs or shorter work weeks? You can see here the manufacturing outlook by quarter, which was an important piece. Another data point was, existing home sales. We were a supplier to the appliance industry. We supplied to Whirlpool and GE and Electrolux. So for us, home sales were important. Existing home sales, many times consumers want to replace their appliances. So we wanted to see what does that data look like? Why should we care? And this was part of, from my existing home sales, this would have been a lagging indicator for us, but helping us do that. Here was national home sales. Obviously, you could see, back in 2017, a dip and then a nice large rise. If I was to overlay our sales, our manufacturing looked almost identical to this. Certainly, there was a lag of production that would resemble this, but the curves themselves, the trends would be almost identical. If you look at three main goals of the world's economy, price stability, high employment, and growth, fairly intuitive if you step back and reflect on what would make an economy strong. Again, to sort of recap government's role in business, they certainly can have a role, whether which side of the aisle you're on as to whether how much involvement should be or shouldn't be in business, but there has to be some type of role in that. Another role of government or another role of government in business is through the fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is on the executive side and through Congress. So this is government spending through budgetary requirements, negotiations through the budget office. And so whether it's taxation or government spending, helping to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes. That's different than the monetary policy, and the monetary policy is managed by the Federal Reserve. So they're managing the money and supply through interest rates, and that's done through the Federal Reserve Board. This is Jerome Powell. He was appointed by within the Trump administration, and he is the first. Interestingly enough, he's the first chair that does not hold a PhD degree in economics since 1987. So typically these are apolitical or non-political servants, government servants within the administrations. You can see here that Jerome Powell himself came up through the George H.W. Bush administration in 1992, again was appointed by the Trump administration, but he had been a visiting scholar through the Bipartisan Policy Center. And just most recently, I think within the last couple of weeks, was reconfirmed. So the Biden administration felt like, we don't need to make any changes right now. We may not agree with everything that the Federal Reserve is doing, may not agree with everything that Jerome Powell is doing. But at the end of the day, considering the where we're at, we don't feel like we need to make a change, with the situation. So that brings us to a close of chapter 3. Again, hopefully everyone is reading the chapters before the class, and that this particular discussion presentation just becomes a chance to reiterate, review, and reflect on the information that you've read. If there's anything that you have questions about, feel free to reach out to me through email or schedule some office hours time. And with that, take care of yourself, and we'll see you again soon.